Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be here. As the slide says, the focus of this presentation is to present some insights to help your municipality recover from Hurricane Michael or other disasters. They say that ignorance is bliss, but I can guarantee you that that's not the case after a hurricane and not the case when you're dealing with FEMA. Thinking ahead, on the other hand, is usually desirable, but thinking ahead requires an understanding of the projects and the processes that you're likely to go through, and that's what we'll cover here. Please remember that disasters are traumatic to varying degrees for each individual. The feeling of helplessness, whether due to feeling unable to recover or due to feeling helpless to help those in need, can manifest as fatigue, depression, and anger. It's not unusual to see an increase in cases of abuse and assault, and certainly you'll have to deal with angry residents who want to blame the city or the county for not doing enough for them. As a result, one of the balancing acts you'll need to address regularly is the focus between recovery of the community and the recovery of municipal facilities. They certainly aren't mutually exclusive, but you should have no doubt your FEMA grants are exclusively for your municipal facilities. Also, if you were significantly impacted by Hurricane Michael, you should start expecting a 3 to 5 year recovery process for the municipal facilities, at a minimum. When we were hit by Hurricane Ivan in 2004, it was a 7-year process. I'm sorry to disappoint those of you who thought you'd be done with this in a year or two from now, but you need to adjust those expectations. A major disaster is a sea change to your responsibilities. It affects your entire community and has broad consequences. It's important to recognize that recovery is not undo or rewind. Replacing what was broken or damaged is not a bad plan to start with, but the recovery process also enables you to consider how you might want to evolve some of your facilities to address potential future needs and goals. And a vital tip is to talk with your counterparts regularly, and probably informally, during the recovery process. Most municipalities tend to isolate their recovery activities to themselves, if for no other reason than the time demands of dealing with the recovery in addition to the full-time jobs you had before Hurricane Michael. But comparing notes, ideas, successes, and especially failures is an important process that can yield huge benefits, and there may be opportunities to coordinate activities to make the process better overall. But you won't know if you're not talking with each other. As a municipality, you have access to FEMA aid, which is far in excess of any other elements in your community, many of which will have no access to recovery aid. I bring this up because each element will go through the recovery process at different speeds, and that's important to keep in mind. Some businesses will reopen quickly, for some it may be years or never. Some residents will rebuild quickly, and alternatively for some it may be a year or more before they can even begin. But the municipalities must recognize that they have an impact on those recoveries, potentially positive and potentially negative. The city or county can be a focal point, as many of you already are, in helping those in need find recovery resources. And alternatively, you may have codes and ordinances that are unintentionally making recovery more difficult than it needs to be. It may make sense to look at what ordinances are creating unnecessary hurdles to the recovery of others. In Gulf Breeze, we waived ordinances to allow residents to have trailers on their lots, so residents could stay residents while they oversaw the repair and rebuilding of their houses. Panama City appears to be doing this as well. We also put new ordinances in place to penalize dumping debris on empty lots to avoid residential contractors from taking unfair and ineligible advantage of the debris collection process. The recovery process is now the new normal, and your ordinances in force need to support, not hinder the process. One mental exercise I would strongly recommend you spend some time considering is, how would we proceed if there were no FEMA? If you had only the funds in your reserves, how would you reinvent your operations and facilities? It's a useful question to help figure out what some potential directions your recovery might take other than strictly restoring what was damaged. And a really gut-wrenching question is, what would your staffing look like in that scenario? This exercise can be helpful sometimes to tease out priorities from elected officials as well. Also, when you run into some areas that FEMA won't fund, it may spur some creative thinking. You're probably already aware of some small businesses that were hit hard. The sad truth is that 40 to 60% of small businesses that don't reopen within 30 days will never reopen. Some because they don't have adequate insurance and can't afford to reopen. Some because key employees evacuated and got jobs elsewhere and they can't reopen. Surprisingly, in most disasters, Katrina being a major exception, area populations actually increase 2 years afterward, generally in the range of 10 to 15%. That statistic can have important implications for capacity planning for utilities and schools, especially if restoration isn't complete at the time. If you've been talking with your finance staff, you may already know that your cash is being depleted at a rapid rate. Typically, your cash outflow will jump about 400% for the next 6 months. We're going to dwell on this point for the next few slides. This pie chart breaks out the types of recovery expenditures that FEMA reimburses. On average, over its history, FEMA has ended up funding about $53 million for a major disaster to municipalities. And as you can see, the lion's share of those costs are in emergency response costs and debris collection, between 55 and 60% of that pie. You haven't even started to spend for the last 40%. That's rebuilding. But you've already incurred the cost for virtually all of the emergency response. Maybe you've gotten the invoices for mutual aid. Maybe you haven't, but you've certainly incurred the costs. And I assume most of you have debris contractors and debris monitors in the streets as we speak. And that's going to be a major cash outflow. Therefore, if you haven't done so already, your number one priority when you leave this presentation should be to get adequate financing in place for the recovery. Go to your local bank or banks and get the largest standby line of credit they'll provide. FEMA is not your banker, and I guarantee you that reimbursement will be slower in coming in than you want and maybe than you need. Now, there is a community disaster loan program now in the law for FEMA, but only for municipalities that can demonstrate at least 25% tax revenue loss after the disaster, and it only covers up to 50% of your operating, not your capital budget. So this is not a quick or immediate loan. This information is from a 2009 report that is about the only document describing the loan program on the FEMA site. I can tell you that a news article I saw indicated that the first allotment of CDL loans for Puerto Rico did not get approved for some 9 months after Hurricane Maria. I wouldn't not pursue this funding if it's available, but it means that you should not rely on it as a source of cash for at least 9 to 12 months. So talk to your local banks now. Also, get your finance folks to develop a flexible municipal cash flow model you can use to look at what-if scenarios. Use that to layer in potential contractor payments. Maybe reconsider your timing for your second and third debris passes. Maybe even develop bid specs to coordinate payment timing with your cash flow. But remember that if you require contractors to finance you, you'll have fewer contractors that are able to bid for that requirement, and that may end up excluding some of your local businesses as well as raising your costs. And to answer the question before you even ask it, no, FEMA will not reimburse interest costs of any kind, including financing costs in contractor invoices. Okay, let's start talking about FEMA in earnest. And I want you to know up front that I'm a fan of FEMA and the Stafford Act, which is the law that created FEMA. It's one of the most benevolent pieces of legislation out there, and I have tremendous respect for its goals and the vast majority of its people. It's important to understand, however, that the Stafford Act is fairly broad legislation covering a wide variety of emergency response preparation, training, and disaster planning, as well as funding. You, as a municipality, will only be exposed to a small portion of FEMA's activities. I want also to say that especially at the higher levels in FEMA, I have never seen FEMA back away from funding a project that cleared all of their requirements, regardless of how unusual. But you've got to be the one showing them how your atypical project fits with their rules. Dealing with FEMA successfully is about both understanding the framework of the big picture as well as keeping an eye on the details, like those little black circles in this image. Keeping track of the details will drive you crazy, but it's really important to your success. You are a public assistance beneficiary. That's the program for municipalities, the PA program. Residents in your community may be eligible for individual assistance, the IA program. The PA program is a federal grant program, not free money. The primary role of the FEMA personnel you will meet is the administration and documentation of grant requests, your project worksheets, and documentation of your compliance with the grant requirements to approve these customized grants for your projects. As far as you are concerned, FEMA is all about grant management. The common misconception is that FEMA is some sort of independent aid agency that assesses needs and gives out money. It is not. Virtually all PA program money is grant money, and so just like any other grant, you have to apply for it, comply with the documentation requirements, prove eligibility, act in accordance with the grant provisions, and use the funds in accordance with the grant rules and regulations. Most FEMA personnel, and I'll explain why in a minute, are not recovery experts. And those that have enough experience to develop some expertise are not supposed to make suggestions because this is your recovery, not theirs. They do not fix it for you. They do not write RFPs or contracts, nor select contractors and oversee the work. In exceedingly rare exceptions, they may directly engage the Army Corps on what's called a mission assignment, but that's mostly for debris or flood control restoration work. And that's about the extent of FEMA actually doing any recovery work. As I said before, they are not an independent charitable aid foundation who can provide you with funds at their discretion. And remember this, generally FEMA pays on a reimbursement basis for your major projects, so they are not your banker. Your project funding is not about what you need or what you think is fair. It's all about the rules of the grant program for public assistance. So let's touch on that. I said earlier that the public assistance program was a small part of FEMA. The Code of Federal Regulations, Section 44, are the regulations of the Stafford Act. CFR 44 is 613 pages long the last time I looked. Disaster assistance-related programs and regulations comprise 1/6 of that code, and the essential regulations for the PA program are only 15 pages out of that, most of which concern what makes you eligible and insurance requirements. Only 7 pages out of over 600 on what the PA program is supposed to do. Out of those 7 pages of regulations has evolved literally hundreds of pages of precedents, policies, guides, and standard operating procedures. This slide is a bit dated, as the 9500 series documents and the old 321 handbook are now combined in the new Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide issued in April of 2018. I'll tell you now that the guide is a tough read. To me, it looks like it was written by an attorney who was not happy about the assignment. It's important to understand that the further down the pyramid of procedures that you go, the more generalized and interpretive the documents tend to be. That's important to keep in mind because most of FEMA's frontline people are trained on those low-level procedures and generalizations. In many cases, the generalizations will apply, but there are occasionally some rather unique sets of circumstances such that the generalizations may not accurately reflect what the regulations intend. That's when you need to have read the regulations and search through the appeals results to see what relevant precedents might exist and what the supporting interpretation relied on. That's not all you have to do to overcome a generalization, but it's a good start. A quick example. In general, FEMA does not clean up unmaintained property or natural wetlands. Surprisingly, perhaps, the Everglades are not cleaned up when hurricanes hit South Florida. When Ivan hit Gulf Breeze, the storm surge deposited tons of debris in our wetlands. Hot tubs, dumpsters, grease tanks, propane tanks, as well as C&D debris washed from Pensacola Beach onto our shoreline wetlands. We were told again and again that because we could not demonstrate recent maintenance of the wetlands, no debris cleanup would be eligible. And we were told that adamantly by numerous FEMA personnel at various levels. It was not until we could demonstrate that the wetlands were an integral part of our stormwater management system as an outfall, and that the debris was blocking the flow of stormwater to such an extent that it was causing flooding in town, that minds were changed. It was finally approved about a year after the storm and was a unique debris project due to the need to comply with federal EPA regulations and state wetlands protection provisions. All the C&D debris had to be carried out by hand. Wildlife specialists and snake wranglers were engaged by the contractors to protect the crew and the wildlife. A detailed topographic study was required to justify a limited cleanup of the vegetative debris. And yes, it was all reimbursed by FEMA, but it took repackaging the project and a lot of persistence through the initial denials of considering it for eligibility. So, keep in mind that federal regulations and the generalized interpretations thereof don't always produce the expected or desired results. As we've said, the public assistance programs are a small part of the Stafford Act and its regulations, but federal grants are also subject to a wide variety of other regulations. So it's not just CFR 44 you need to be aware of, but also all the General Accounting Office rules for acceptable grant expenses, federal grant rules relating to procurement of services and materials, and funding compliance rules that make your project subject to regulations from OSHA, EPA, and so forth, in addition to making you subject to all the state-level regulations for things like historic preservation review requirements. That, my friends, is the regulatory environment you're operating in to get your projects approved. And that's a rough idea of the scope of what I'm talking about whenever I use the phrase, "and in compliance with federal regulations." The better you understand this up front, the less frustrated you'll be down the road. The one good thing I noticed about the new program and policy guide is that it's heavily footnoted with regulatory citations, which allows you or someone on your staff a ready reference to some of the non-FEMA regulations that are driving their policies, and a really good starting point to research what those regulations actually say. So read the federal manual, preferably before you need it. Ideally, you're already thinking about developing someone on your staff to be your FEMA point person. You need someone who's reading the details and the footnotes and the fine print to help you figure out how a difficult project might be repackaged to make it eligible. So broadly, my recommendations for dealing with FEMA are these. First, these are reimbursement grants, not opportunities to try to make money off of FEMA. You can recover a surprising amount of expenses if you're willing to develop the documentation procedures to justify those costs. But none of this is a gift of cash. Second, FEMA has been the target of frauds by municipalities as well as contractors, and they don't get away with it. Your life and your projects will go much smoother if you constantly demonstrate integrity, competence, and reliability in your dealings with FEMA. Third, Do not limit your recovery plan to what is reimbursable. Make your recovery plan based on what your municipality needs now and in the foreseeable future, and make those projects as reimbursable as possible. You'll need to develop some in-house FEMA expertise in this process, but that's not a bad thing. Also, if for no other reason than your own cash flow, be frugal. You may hear a contractor tell you not to worry about the cost because FEMA will cover it. Well, even if that's true, it's still coming out of your pocket first, and if FEMA ultimately decides the cost is not reasonable, they may well ask for it back. Frugality is not a bad thing during recovery. You should have a general awareness of how FEMA gets the money for your projects. This is the basic cycle. The preliminary damage assessments you've provided are the basis for the initial federal appropriations that FEMA requests and is usually allocated, which then becomes earmarked as projects are approved. Once a project is approved for funding, it's allocated to the state for eventual distribution to you. And while more and more preliminary project requests are submitted, there are revised cost estimates that drive changes to the damage assessment, which may trigger additional appropriations to FEMA. But this is not instantaneous. Each step takes time, especially if Congress is not in session to approve the appropriations. The lesson to take from this is that FEMA does not have an endless supply of cash available to it. It can only disperse the funding that has been appropriated for this particular disaster. Also, it highlights the importance of ensuring the scope of your initial disaster assessments were adequate and encompass all your likely projects, and that you keep that assessment updated. It also may help you understand why there may be delays in obtaining funding or approvals down the road. As I've said before, FEMA money is not free money, and it comes with a few restrictions that you might as well acknowledge up front. First is that you will need to perpetually insure or document and prove the uninsurability of any facility that you use FEMA funds on. And by the way, the expense of the premium is not a consideration, nor is it reimbursable. Here's the phrase I warned you about earlier. It all must comply with federal spending regulations. Yes, all those regulations. And finally, your FEMA projects will be subject to not just what FEMA calls a closeout review, but also future FEMA and Office of Inspector General detail audits. So keep your documentation beyond your normal retention policies. It may interest you to know that FEMA, as a federal agency, only has about 230 full-time staff. The thousands of personnel in the field throughout the U.S. and in your office are contractors working full-time for typically a 3 to 5 year period. This is why the personnel you meet are unlikely to be recovery experts. They're contract staff, and this may be their first deployment. You may never meet a real FEMA federal employee, although all the contractors will tell you that they're employed by FEMA. FEMA will never send money to you directly. It always channels funding through the State Department of Emergency Management. In FEMA terminology, the state is the applicant for disaster funds, not you. You are the sub-applicant, or in grant terminology, the pass-through recipient. The state is responsible for ensuring that you've complied with all the FEMA grant provisions before it passes along reimbursements to you, so the state will likely have field personnel in your office as well. And likely, they will also be contractors, typically with some emergency management background. Despite all their training and good intentions, mistakes will be made. It's your responsibility to catch any mistakes, particularly before you sign off on a project. Again, this argues for developing some in-house expertise that is dedicated to the FEMA process, and why you should never blindly sign off without a review of the project specifics. Now that you have a little context, we can touch on the core of the public assistance program. Point 1. When FEMA pays for something, they only pay 75% of it. The state of Florida will kick in another 12.5% of the costs, or more if you've qualified under the state of Florida Funding Disaster Waiver Program. If not, your reserves need to fund the last 12.5%, or whatever the state doesn't cover. So on a $10 million project, you'll have to front the costs. Not all generally, as you'll get some reimbursement as you make payments on lengthy projects, and end up using municipal funds to cover $1.25 million at the end of the day. Again, this is why I recommend that cash flow model back at the beginning, as well as why it's important to be frugal. Every $1 million you can take out of the program drops your contribution by $125,000, which is not an insignificant number to your operating revenues. All of your projects will need to fit into one of these 7 categories. Each will have a write-up called a project worksheet, or a PW, and be assigned a number, which, by the way, may get changed without you knowing about it. And each project will be classified as either a small project or a large project. The large projects are those with total costs over $125,500 for disasters in 2018. Costs for projects totaling under $3,140 are considered too small for FEMA and ineligible, so the really small stuff comes out of your pocket as well. Large and small projects get processed differently, so I'll spend a moment on that. Historically, the vast majority of the projects submitted and funded by FEMA are small projects under the large project threshold. About 85% of all of the submissions are in the small project category. But the remaining 15% that are large projects account for over 90% of the funding that FEMA lays out. So that's where FEMA spends the vast amount of its time, attention, review, and document inspection time. As a result, small projects are likely to be approved faster and funded faster, sometimes with amounts that are based on firm estimates rather than actual expenditures. So this can be an area that can actually help your cash flow occasionally. The lesson to draw here is that if you can reasonably break up a large project into a few smaller projects, it may well be a good thing to consider. This slide is a bit dated, but you're likely to see a sequence like this in a FEMA presentation illustrating the process of how you get funded. I call it the snake, and it gives a simplistic summary of the steps to get from disaster to funding. It looks fairly simple, straightforward, and logical, doesn't it? The bottom half seems pretty direct. Formulate your projects, get them reviewed and approved, funding goes to the state, the grantee, and then to you. So why is the FEMA process a big deal? Well, let's take a brief look at project formulation, or the creation of a PW, for a moment. Each PW funded by FEMA needs to fit through an eligibility funnel that basically tests, was the disaster eligible? Are you eligible? The answer to both of those, assuming all of you are representing municipalities and signed your FEMA application for disaster aid, contracts, and grant applications, is yes. Next, is the facility or the thing that was damaged eligible? In most cases, if it fits in one of the 7 categories, it was in active use and is reasonably maintained, and is owned by or the responsibility of the municipality, the answer here will be yes as well. Then we get to the more time-consuming parts of the process, in part because you and FEMA will have to come to agreement on these pieces. Was the damage caused by the disaster, and exactly how much damage was there? FEMA will want measurements for everything. What's the scope of work that's required to restore what was damaged? And here we get into whether or not there are new codes and standards that need to be applied. And again, specific measurements and amounts. And what are the costs required to accomplish that scope of work, and are they reasonable in FEMA's opinion? Once all of that's done, then we have a project that is potentially fundable by FEMA at 75%. Measurements are hugely important to FEMA. FEMA regulations only pay for the restoration of what was damaged, so it wants to fill the pothole, not repave the road. As a result, FEMA requires detailed description of damage, and one of the first reviews your PW will experience will be to compare that the measurements for the scope of work to repair correspond to the measurements of the damage. A red flag goes up if the scope of work exceeds the scope of damage without very good justification of why there's a difference. And there can be good reasons, like the updated codes and standards that I mentioned. Measurements are a big part of the FEMA process, so like it says, for FEMA and generally for engineers, the only thing more important is breathing. So, back to what's eligible. We've made sure the disaster caused the damage, and you and the facility are eligible. We've got a scope of work approved and identified the eligible costs, and we're making sure the scope of work is appropriate for the scope of damage identified. Important details. Your procurement process must encompass both federal procurement requirements for grants and be compliant with your pre-disaster procurement requirements. Also, the project funding may not include costs eligible for reimbursement from insurance or funding from any other grant source, whether you knew about the grant or not. So you need to make sure that you've gotten all your due from your insurer, and you've checked far and wide for disaster-related recovery grants, such as from HUD or the Department of Agriculture. FEMA is, by statute, grant aid of last resort. Costs you want reimbursed need to be fully documented, not just what was paid, but why. What specifically did you receive? And if they're internal costs, you need timesheets, work and dispatch logs, materials requisitions and usage documents. Relevant photos are always helpful, etc., etc. FEMA will cover rebuilding to current codes and standards, as we've mentioned, but you must demonstrate that such standards apply to your facilities, not just that it's current best practices. That's not always easy. Many local codes are strictly for residential and commercial buildings. They don't set codes for the municipal buildings. And finally, each PW is eligible to include the direct administrative costs related to the PW, if it's fully documented and justified. Did your attorney review the RFP or the contract? That cost is potentially eligible. Did you review the RFP and the contract? Your time can be eligible if you're keeping a time log. This is where outside consultants working with you can also have their costs reimbursed if there's sufficient detail and justification. Omissions in this area due to lack of documentation are where municipalities repeatedly miss out on potential reimbursements. There's a little quirk here that's important to note. FEMA will want to know the direct administrative costs, or DAC costs, when you submit the PW for approval for review. That's far before you'll incur a lot of your direct administrative costs. So you should include reasonable, but not necessarily conservative, estimates for those costs. This can take some time and spreadsheet smarts to try to forecast the personnel hours and costs for all the likely activity of your administrative efforts. For large PWs, FEMA will only reimburse the costs that you actually incurred and can justify that are below your approved estimate. This last tip is certainly worth the price of admission and then some. You will likely be subject to have a federal single source audit report as part of your annual audit. Typically, your auditors will charge you 0.6% of the value of the PWs closed or funded in a given year for that single source audit. Talk to your auditors and get in writing the calculations of the federal single source audit fee and add that to your DAC estimate. On a $10 million PW, that's an incremental $60,000 in costs that's most often missed. In dealing with FEMA, it's not the size of the financial support you need, but the size of the financial needs you can support. The more you can document, the better your support. Keep all documents, preferably originals, as well as digital copies of everything FEMA asks for, and everything related to the project you can think of, from bid evaluation notes to bank statements, photos of the damage and measurement of the damage, and progress of rebuilding. Keep copies of your insurance coverage in place before the storm and for each year after as well. And be sure the rebuilt items are listed on the updated insurance coverage. Seriously, there is no such thing as too much documentation when FEMA comes knocking 5 years later asking you for something they can't find. This is the list of project worksheet components. I'm not going to go over this in detail, except to point out those two elements toward the bottom, the others. This is where a lot of things will slow down or end up requiring multiple submissions of a PW. It's difficult for the frontline FEMA personnel to know what is sufficient documentation in some instances. They aren't trained for PW closeout audits, but they are expected to provide all the necessary details to satisfy that audit. So they may end up stalling project submissions while they try to figure out how much information is likely to be enough. And by the way, that information is coming from you, so that all adds to the workload. I'll say it again, you can never have too much documentation. Let's cover a few things that FEMA will not reimburse, just so you know up front. Below the small project minimum, unreimbursable, but you may be able to get around that by grouping small costs logically. Instead of a PW for each vehicle's repair, maybe a PW for all vehicle repairs. Landscaping. FEMA doesn't pay for trees or sod or landscaping, except if it's for soil stabilization. No paperwork, no reimbursement. It's that simple. You may have changed your procurement procedures since the hurricane to speed the process up. FEMA doesn't care. You must use your pre-disaster procurement procedures for cost to be eligible for all projects, regardless of what you can do now. Non-incremental payroll. This relates to emergency costs mainly. Only overtime or additions to staff due to the hurricane will be potentially considered. There are exceptions where emergency repairs might be classified as permanent repair. Then direct time is allowed. Rough estimates, contingency costs, both of them are no-go. Firm quotes on small PWs may be accepted. I want to be clear here. Many of your project submissions will have estimates included and be approved, but actual reimbursement will only be for actual costs incurred and documented. If you exceeded that approved level, you will have to request an amended PW for the increased costs and justify the increase. As I said before, FEMA is not your bank and will not cover financing charges or fines or penalties. And aside from codes and standards adjustments and cost-effective mitigation alteration, FEMA will not cover the cost of modifications or improvements to a facility. They will only reimburse the scope of work that restores the scope of damage. These situations are called improved projects and are reasonably common, and FEMA will approve these projects but will not pay the full cost, only the costs attributable to repair of the original facility. And getting to agreement on that number can take some time. This isn't a comprehensive list by any means, but the last key item that FEMA won't fund is projects filed or completed after the FEMA established deadlines. What deadlines, you ask? Well, these are the default deadlines typically in place. 60 days for the final initial damage assessment, 180 days for debris collection and completion of emergency work, and 18 months for your projects. FEMA often extends waivers on these deadlines, either universally or on a project-by-project basis. You need to pay attention to the deadlines and make sure you have copies of all notices of waivers in your own project records. Ask for extensions early. Generally, FEMA will work with you. Now, let's take a look at the process to actually get your first major project reimbursement. Let's assume you had, say, fencing around a ball field, and between wind and storm surge it was totaled. You measured it, and it was 400 yards. The cost to remove the old fencing and replace it is quoted as, say, $200,000, with the same size posts and gates and such. You've got pictures, measurements, firm quotes, and hopefully your DAC costs in there, and you approve it for submission, and the review process starts. Did you prove it was not covered by insurance? It's not. Okay. Are there environmental EPA constraints on this construction? Probably not. So it moves on to floodplain. Maybe in floodplain review, they say it needs stronger posts. So you amend the PW and resubmit it, and the process starts again. And then they want proof it complies with ADA accessibility. So you amend and resubmit. And finally, you get notice that the project is obligated. Great. FEMA sends money to the state awaiting your completion of the project. You complete your fencing project and submit the invoices and proof of payment of those invoices. The state then sends it to its own specialist review. Then a supervisor reviews it, and if anything is changed, like your DAC costs, or if ADA access required more concrete for the entry sidewalk than originally approved, it goes back to the project review process. Otherwise, 2 more approvals from the state finance and accounting to do their review and issue an acceptance, and then Treasury reviews it to make sure they have the funds they need, and the funds transfers then takes place. In the best of all worlds, the state will chew up at least 30 days from your submission of receipts for reimbursement to you getting the cash. According to the regulations, FEMA has 45 days to obligate your PW or explain why. Notice, however, that the explanation, if one is given, is to the grantee. That's the state. So you may never hear anything. This little nugget of knowledge can stir things up. In one instance, as I recall, we'd been waiting well in excess of 6 months for approval. And I started pushing up the FEMA chain of command to find out why, but nobody seemed to have answers. So I asked, can I get a list of federal regulations you're not following in addition to this one, so at least I know what the rules are? They were not happy with me, but we didn't have any major delays after that. I suspect FEMA was waiting on additional appropriations, but no one would say that. Sometimes they'll admit it, but generally, FEMA won't tell you that there are additional reviews for very large PWs, typically over $1 million and over $10 million. They also won't admit when they've run out of appropriations and are waiting for more. They also won't tell you if the state has run out of designated funding, and that happens. And when either of those happen, no additional PWs get approved or reimbursed until the funding issues are resolved. Another item you should be aware of is that the frontline staff are often given productivity targets or deadlines. Early on, it will be getting lots of PWs submitted. Far down the road, it will be project completion deadlines. You will want to be responsive and not create unreasonable delays, but their deadlines are not related to your decisions about what's in the best interest of your recovery, at least not as long as you have your time extensions and waivers in your files. Assets that were contributed to you, a building, a used fire truck, a bridge, can be eligible. So can assets you lease and are fully responsible for, even $1 a year type leases. Also, buildings you're not using but you maintain can be eligible. These can be very useful for developing alternative projects, where 75% of the restoration cost can be used for virtually any capital project. That's 75% of which FEMA will fund 75%, by the way. So about 56%, plus about 9% from the state. While you need to establish a good working relationship with the field staff, you should also know they will be redeployed without any notice to you. So again, Keep a copy of everything you give to FEMA in your own files, and recognize you may have to develop a new relationship with a new face at pretty much any time. And, as you might expect when an organization has to hire hundreds or thousands of contractors, the quality and the personalities will be variable. There will be superstars and there will be duds. Most will be somewhere in the middle, well-meaning and reasonably competent. There's not much you can do about that, but it's another good reason to develop your own in-house expertise. Here's another little nugget I came across because, well, I read the fine print. An immediate threat means within 5 years. Now, obviously, this is intended to apply to leaning trees and damaged bridges and structures, but it's the only instance that the time frame for the word immediate is defined. Applying this definition to the word immediate can yield some interesting and sometimes useful interpretations elsewhere in the code, but I don't guarantee you'll always be taken seriously. Now, be careful with this tip because it can easily be abused. Your debris contractors are being paid by the cubic yard, not the hour. FEMA pays based on how much they pick up, not how fast or whether they used the equipment for anything else while they were in town. On a few occasions, our contractors were willing to use their equipment to help residents get oversized debris short distances to the right-of-way. There's nothing wrong with this as long as the debris is otherwise eligible. We trained our monitors to anticipate this, and they collected signed, hold harmless, and right of entry forms for every instance, so the contractor, the city, and FEMA wouldn't be held responsible for any property damage. We never made this public knowledge. Once the contractor agreed, our monitors briefed individual homeowners where obvious situations existed and warned them that there could well be substantial damage to sprinklers or mailboxes, landscaping and trees and underground pipes that the homeowners would be responsible for if the contractor used their skid steers to move the debris. Most of this was for things like tree root balls, where the rest of the tree was already cut up and in the right-of-way. This should never be used to demolish a damaged structure, nor any debris not already in the front yard. Most of the time, this might have involved maybe 15 minutes, but it saved big headaches for a few residents. The sofa cushions are where you lose money and don't realize it until much later. It happens on the couch, and it happens with FEMA and hurricanes. FEMA-specific items include unreported damage. They won't fund what isn't reported by the deadlines. Utility repairs by staff. You know they did temporary and permanent fixes, but can you document the details to get it reimbursed? Unreported volunteer time. Yes, that's eligible. Incomplete documentation of direct administrative costs. That's always an issue. And broadly, a lack of knowledge to pursue costs that you were eligible for, but were unclaimed, eligible for, but were undocumented, and eligible for, but was wrongly rejected by the FEMA front line. For next time, look at where your policies created unnecessary headaches or increased costs, and consider adopting emergency status ordinances. Close out mistakes by FEMA or you, especially with regard to lost documents that you could have sworn FEMA had. Not pursuing appeals for projects you honestly believe fit the regulations. Other areas include the state match waiver. The state may cover up to 25% of your PW, not just 12.5%. USDA drainage grants are the most common debris in drainage canal kind of grants available for disasters, but don't stop looking there. Adjusters and appraisers. Money from your insurance company comes much faster and with fewer headaches than from FEMA. Make sure you're getting all that's due, and make sure you agree with their cost estimates. Independent adjusters and damage appraisers can also help create more reliable, detailed reconstruction cost estimates than you can sometimes get from FEMA. For big, improved project PWs, I would recommend serious consideration of hiring a well-respected construction appraiser to ensure you're getting an accurate cost of the restoration portion. As I said, FEMA skills are variable, especially when factoring changes in new codes, ADA compliance, etc. Manage your costs overall for everyone that you engage. Don't let your lawyer waste time on FEMA issues they don't need to or aren't qualified for. You can't sue FEMA. Consider reducing your costs by directly hiring debris monitors for the second and third pass. Basically, be frugal. Manage your cash flow. Time your projects and payments to minimize your finance costs. Lastly, keep looking for other grant sources and keep asking FEMA for any sources you should know about, repeatedly. Closeout audits can be where whatever you didn't know about comes back to bite you, or they can be a breeze. The reason for the difference between the scope of damage and the scope of work isn't in FEMA's electronic files. It better be in your files. A review of your insurance indicates that you should have received more from your insurer. Can we have our money back, please? Oh, and this federal highway grant should have covered the first debris pass on these 50 roads, so we need our money back on that too. And it doesn't look like you performed the required NEPA survey for endangered wildlife while you changed the footprint of this parking lot, so that's no longer eligible. The closeout audit personnel have the benefit of hindsight and a lot of time to double-check all the regulations that were supposed to be complied with. They're not out to play gotcha, but it's their job to make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Your outside FEMA experts should be making sure all of this is taking place as you develop the projects, and your inside FEMA person should be making sure you have copies of all the documents so there are no surprises. A common mistake is to find out that you needed permits for temporary debris sites because the state, not FEMA, says you must have them. If you don't already have them, get them now. Keep RFP and bid evaluation information in your files, especially if you didn't choose the lowest bidder. And that better be a well-justified and documented set of reasons. Proof of damage? 5 years out after you've done the repair, you will still need to prove what happened. Pictures, measurements, pictures of measurements. You can never document enough. Yep, this again, and I can't stress it enough. Compliance with all federal laws and grant requirements, including single audit reports, and that only GAO-approved costs are included in your costs. It's hard to prove that something doesn't exist, so make sure you've looked high and low for alternative grants. Succeeding in your recovery, however you define success, is unlikely to be a direct path. At times, resources may be limited or insufficient. Priorities may shift, goals and objectives may shift, personnel will change, and even some of the rules may change. Don't abuse it, but sometimes you may need to make a ruckus to get some attention or to get the attention of someone higher up. An occasionally squeaky wheel gets the grease, but remember that a perpetually squeaky wheel gets ignored or replaced. After everything I've said, I know it may look like an uphill battle to get wherever you want to be. It may seem overwhelming, but it's not. It's a process you'll learn and adapt to. It may seem like a long shot, but with fortitude, persistence, and a little knowledge, you'll look back and be amazed at what you've accomplished at the other end of all of this. My recommendations for your next steps: talk to your bankers. Start planning your cash flow. Get waivers for the debris collection timing. Start tracking and documenting for administrative costs. Keep talking to each other. Don't try to entirely outsource your knowledge of FEMA. And try to get elected officials to understand some of this as well. Thank you for your time. I hope I've spurred some ideas for you, and I sincerely wish you all the best possible success in your recovery process.